Hey there, everyone. Welcome back. Now that the Yuletide is over and the new year has officially begun, I think it's time to take a moment to reflect on where the modern heathen and pagan movements are in the world, what is going on within our community, and what this year holds. Before I really jump into the episode, I first want to give a short little important update for everyone. The Fire and Ice community is currently offering a new round of classes in our particular brand of heathenry, as well as generally in Nordic spirituality, paganism, and practice. So if you're interested, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find information on our teachers, on what we're offering, and all that good stuff. This time around, we're offering multiple sections so that classes can be more available to people with different availability and needs, and as far as time's concerned. And we will be also initiating a new round of classes that will follow up on this one beginning in March. All classes are conducted remotely over Zoom, so all you need to jump on in is a solid internet connection, and donations are on a sliding scale based on what you can best afford. So if you're interested in learning more and having some direct hands-on instruction, please head on over to onblackwings.com. And now, let's get on with the heavy stuff. Now, if you, like me, listen to entirely too many political and current events podcasts, though I certainly do like some old gods of Appalachia now and then, you're probably seeing a general trend of podcasters offering their predictions for the coming year, and so far, the consensus that seems to be brewing is not a pretty one. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. 2023 was in a lot of ways a really rough year across the board. Just about everyone has probably noticed the rising cost of living crisis, or the increasing frequency of extreme weather events, as well as just generally unusual climate patterns. By now, everyone probably has experienced an extreme weather event. And there are certainly much larger swaths of the world who are far more familiar with the kind of choking skies and smoke blotting out the sun that plagued the U.S. West Coast and much of Australia throughout 2019 and 2020. Meanwhile, war and threat of war continues to grow. The conflict in Ukraine has continued and seems to have bogged down. In the Middle East, the latest round of the Israeli military shelling and bombing Gaza has kicked off. And this time is easily the worst that I have seen in my lifetime. In the first 6 days of the conflict alone, Israeli military forces dropped more bombs on Gaza, an inhabited area approximately the size of downtown Detroit and populated by over 2 million Palestinians, than the United States military dropped on the entire country of Afghanistan in the year 2019. There are many international observers who specialize in studying conflict who have argued that the level of devastation that has been inflicted by bombing has not been seen in the world since the bombing campaigns of the Second World War. In the wake of this new round of conflict, there have been surges in both genuine anti-Semitic violence as well as anti-Muslim violence, some of which has been instigated by far-right actors, white nationalists, and white supremacists seeking to ride the coattails of crisis to spread their noxious ideologies. Also, I want to be clear when I say far-right actors instigating violence, I mean of both kinds of violence. Because remember, these folks hate Jews, Muslims, anyone they don't consider to be white enough, and now increasingly anyone who also isn't Christian enough. The United States, in particular, is poised to enter what will easily be yet another of the most important elections in everyone's lifetimes. And unfortunately, that's a very serious statement. Having the future of democracy being increasingly at stake with each passing ballot and election day is not really a healthy political environment for anyone. This is also part of a bigger global trend of rising far-right and authoritarian politics, with far-right actors taking cues from successes for their movement in whatever parts of the world those happen. The clearest example of this in the United States would be Project 2025, which is basically a blueprint for how do right-wingers legally create a one-man dictatorship out of the presidency. The model for this guidebook comes from Putin's Russia, Viktor Orban's Hungary, and Narendra Modi's India. Amidst all of this tumult and upheaval are a surprising amount of green shoots, particularly when we're talking in the pagan movement. In the United States, for example, which is where I've got the most reliable data, pagan and heathen practices, the witch movement, and all of that sort of big, really messy bucket of spiritualities continues to be the fastest growing in the country. Sure, there's a lot of the usual stuff that you see going on in the worlds of heathenry and paganism, like the latest attempt at someone making a run at being the self-proclaimed Asa Pope of all heathenry, which is going about as well as the last 5 or 6 attempts by ambitious people to craft an Asa mitre and Asa scepter for themselves. This turmoil has not stopped continued conversation, deepening of practice and knowledge, as well as growth into new and exciting areas. One trend, for example, which is spearheaded by Winifred Hodge Rose and other similar researchers that I think is very promising, is more examination of the heathen concept of the self and the soul. The different greater crises that are happening in the broader world are also not going without notice or response. As difficult as it can be to get up in the morning and look at anything related to current events, I know there's certainly days where putting on one's favorite news podcast feels far more like a really nasty, dirty chore than an act of informing oneself. There are green shoots, and particularly when you're talking our communities, there is something of a bright future. As we move through the Yuletide and the days begin growing longer, I think it's safe to say that the sun is also rising on our world. I'm going to lay all of this out in 3 big chunks over the course of this episode. I'm going to first get right into what I see as the growing trends and likely future for our movements, and for the movements that heathenry is operating parallel and sometimes in cooperation with. I'm going to then broadly step out to the growing social crisis, which is presenting challenges to everybody because, what impacts the social and material is going to make life much more difficult, but also in a lot of ways is feeding the growth of movements like paganism and heathenry. I'm then going to wrap things up with what I'd like to call the green shoots, the promise of a new dawn and new possibilities that's already emerging in the world. As much as there's a lot of doom, gloom, and crisis in the news and in the media, there are reasons for hope, and there are reasons to look forward to a potentially better future. It is going to take a lot of work and a lot of fight. It's a good thing, then, that heathens aren't shy about wading into a good fight for a good reason. Throughout this episode, I'm going to be bringing up examples from and referring to the United States of America. Not so much to say, as goes America, so goes the world, but rather because I live here and I'm much more directly familiar with what's happening here. And by explaining the particulars of what seems to be brewing in terms of America's political and social crisis, I hope to also at least give some guidance and ideas for folks in other parts of the world who are dealing with similar problems. So let's talk a bit about our shared movements. And when I'm talking shared movements, I'm talking, of course, heathenry specifically, paganism generally, and the broader witchcraft spirituality movement, which overlaps heavily with paganism, but is not necessarily the same. There are, after all, a pretty big and diverse set of witch communities that are not pagan in origin or orientation, who nonetheless, because of the fluidity that exists in those spaces, have quite a bit of overlap with the stuff that we do. In the United States, as of 2021, the estimated number of pagans, heathens, and witches was pegged at around 1.5 million to 2 million people, give or take. This number is also one that you really got to put an asterisk next to, because documenting and recording anything definitive about this movement is extremely difficult. Even the major institutions that we have, whether you're talking media outlets like the Wild Hunt, organizations like the Troth, the ADF, the Covenant of the Goddess, reclaiming the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, or like say the different national heathen organizations in Europe, still only really represent a small percentage of those broader populations. And this is based on populations we know about. It's very safe to assume that there are significantly larger pockets and groups, as well as individuals out there who aren't really plugged into this world or only brush up against it tangentially for a variety of reasons. The fact is, much of paganism often has a feeling of ships passing in the night. That perhaps there's someone that you see on the bus or on your morning commute, or that you know in social circles who occasionally drops references that leave you wondering, are they possibly a closeted pagan? Is that metalhead that I ran into at the show who's wearing a hammer just into heavy metal, or is there something more going on there? There's always this kind of ambiguity because we are a deeply underground and decentralized movement. Regardless, there's no question that we are growing at a rapid rate, easily the fastest in the United States. That 1.5 million number, which comes from the Pew Forum on Religion, for example, would peg the overall pagan movement as having as many members as the mainline Protestant Presbyterian Church of America. And most of mainstream society has probably at least vaguely heard of Presbyterians. I know they were the local church that my parents took us to for all of 5 minutes when I was growing up, for example. Other parts of the world are seeing even greater degrees of growth and visibility. The Scottish Minister for Equalities, for example, which is to say the government minister, sort of, similar to a cabinet secretary or something, just this past December put out a happy solstice message to all the pagans of Scotland, which is something I never thought I'd see from any government official anywhere ever. Sure, there's the usual problems of influencers behaving badly, people trying to set up their own little cults of personality, abuse, and the unending arguments over what inclusivity really means, although that one mostly seems to be settling into one of two camps of folks that are building towards a social justice influence concept of inclusivity, which means yes, we're bringing everyone in. We are challenging our biases and assumptions and building structures that encourage cooperation and inclusion. and those who are kind of more in the direction of we are inclusive because we want to keep the Nazis out and not be confused with that dude in all the appropriated garb who stood in the middle of the Capitol on January 6th. Though this isn't really a new tension. Like, this is something that's been going on in arguments and debates over inclusion for almost all the time I've been a heathen, at the absolute minimum, and easily longer than that. There are also, to zoom out a little bit back to the bigger picture, growing, I wouldn't necessarily say acceptance, but belief in certain things that are strongly associated with our movements. For example, an estimated 21% of Americans admit in polling to believing in spells or witchcraft. Now, I'm not going to say all or even most of those folks are definitely pagan sympathetic. After all, there's lots of Christian fundamentalists who absolutely believe in witchcraft too, but not in a healthy or empowering way, but more in a let's get Greg Locke to shout about demons on the pulpit sort of fashion. But nonetheless, that is part of that growing background of there's an increasing acceptance of these alternatives. And I think we need to turn to why that's happening. Based on available information, polling data, anecdotal experiences, and all that other good stuff, I think you could boil it down to 3 main points. First, mainstream religions are in a deep state of crisis. Second, the climate crisis. And third, I guess you could call it polycrisis, because there isn't really one, but many crises besetting society at large these days. I'll start first with the question of mainstream religions. It's not hard when you open up your favorite news page to find examples of religious institutions behaving extremely badly. And I'm not talking about far-right politics here, though I am going to get into that in a bit. So put a pin in that for a second. Instead, I'm talking about the more nasty garden variety kind of abuses of power and authority. The Catholic Church, for example, has long been mired in the massive sexual abuse scandal that's been roiling throughout the church, where church officials relocated and covered for abusive priests in an effort to shield the church's reputation from harm, leading to lawsuits, investigations, exposés, and all kinds of things that have torn through the ranks of the Catholic faithful. With it has also come declining attendance, church facilities having to be sold off to cover the costs of these lawsuits, and all kinds of other similar problems that point to a Catholic Church that currently is really only growing in Africa and other parts of the world, and is in steep decline in the Americas and Europe. There's also been the exposure of deep abuses like the Magdalene laundries and all kinds of other just really, really awful stuff that happened in Ireland, which was once a deeply Catholic country, and recently voted to legalize abortion through a direct referendum of the voters. The Catholic Church is not the only institution that has been caught behaving extremely badly. The Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, has been under investigation by the FBI for at least a year or so for doing the exact same thing as the church regarding sexual abuse and protecting pastors who abused congregants and children, and I'm not getting into any more details than that. The Mormon Church of Latter-day Saints has also, as it turns out, been doing pretty much the exact same thing. It's almost as if when you have a religious structure that emphasizes hierarchy, obedience to those who are ordained as having special holy power and speaking for God, and that these are then people that are safe to be alone with, that you wind up with abuse. And all that hierarchy and patriarchy and all that stuff then leads to the larger institution, instead of offering restitution, making repair, and seeking to fix the problem, immediately turning towards defending themselves and defending their image at the expense of genuine harm to people. Independent megachurches also keep getting caught not just doing this kind of culty, let's abuse our congregants behavior, but also garden variety, let's skim from the money, let's do a little bit of embezzling from the collection plate, and all kinds of other similarly just really nasty, corrupt behavior that you don't expect from religious leaders. It also probably doesn't help that prosperity gospel, as epitomized by Joel Osteen, is still an extremely visible and, let's be honest, garish form of Christianity that encourages and glorifies the accumulation of wealth without really asking about the ethics of doing it. The overall feeling, image, and result of all this is these kind of mainstream religious institutions are facing deep crises. Poll after poll and study after study have shown that the only exceptions within Christianity to this trend of declining congregations and declining influence are the charismatic Christian movement. And I think that is also something that's kind of interesting from a pagan perspective, because those churches certainly are not free of these abuses and these problems, but they at least are groping towards an ecstatic form of practice, which at the very least looks really incredible and awesome, and for folks who have been in that world is an incredible way to plug into the divine. Granted, it does it in a very authoritarian way, but I don't think it should be surprising that the one branch of Christianity that's actively embracing the extraordinary is the only one that's managing to buck this trend of decline. And even they are still prone to abuse, misuse, and naked corruption. For folks who are familiar with their religious history, these things are the stuff of new religious movements, schisms, and breaks within tradition that also open the way for new religions to emerge. The Protestant Reformation is a great example of this, especially because it's one that's well documented and taught in schools all over the place as a major world event. But the same could also be said of the Roman state religion at the time of the rise of Christianity. Now, granted, a big part of how Christianity was able to take power was thanks to receiving the imperial blessing, imperial funding, and also a lot of violence and persecution. But Christianity was only able to gain its appeal in the Roman Empire in the first place because the Roman state religion had largely been hollowed out to being a tool of power and authority. At the time of Constantine, Christianity was not the only, you could say, non-mainstream religious sect that had widespread appeal. There was certainly a point in time when it looked like the cult of Isis could have wound up as the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, and leading up to Constantine, there were attempts to affirm what was referred to as the cult of Sol Invictus as a way of reinvigorating the Roman state religion. When it comes to mainstream religion, particularly Christianity, paganism seems to now be in a similar position that early Christians were, as a group of countercultural, sometimes dissident religious movements with sharp critiques of these failings and genuine, not always consistent, but at least sincere efforts to address and fix them. The lack of authoritarian structures and hierarchy particularly tends to be a big draw for people who are leaving these kind of authoritarian environments. as much as there's folks inside the community who bemoan our lack of broad organization and ability to mobilize resources at scale, which are things that do need to be addressed in some way or another if we're going to survive the different escalating crises in the world. But these same tendencies towards decentralization and anti-authoritarianism are also a big part of what brings people in. Then there is the climate crisis. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that ecological awareness, the growth of what you could call green media, at this point, anyone who is a millennial is probably thinking of stuff like Fern Gully and Free Willy, especially if you're an American, and other similar tendencies in society absolutely have hit the pagan movement like rocket fuel. The decline of mainstream religious institutions is certainly a necessary and critical element to the story of pagan growth. But the fact that pagan, witch, and heathen spiritualities in particular are the ones that are growing is, I think, a direct consequence of the climate crisis. It makes sense, after all, if you're looking at mainstream religion and you're looking at the world around you and you have concerns about ecology and your future in our increasingly precarious world, to turn to spirituality that actively answers and addresses these things. That says, maybe there were ways that broader society erred in assuming that humanity is the dominant power in the world rather than another member of a broad, interconnected web of life that we're all responsible for maintaining. All of this is then further compounded by the growing social crisis, or rather, as I said earlier, the polycrisis. Things like the cost of living crisis, the rise of fascism and authoritarianism across the planet, and everything generally just sort of getting worse for everybody who doesn't have at least 8 figures in their bank account. This, again, is not surprising. Times of crisis encourage people to seek answers from alternatives and different explanations for reality and society. The spiritualist movement, for example, grew out of the tensions and tumult unleashed by industrialization and industrial-scale warfare. The 1960s, 70s, and 80s similarly saw their own explosion of different doomsday cults and doomsday prophets, all of whom were preaching under the shadow of impending, seemingly unavoidable, and completely apocalyptic nuclear war. This also fueled the growth of rapture theology, as best exemplified by books like The Late Great Planet Earth and the Left Behind series, while also triggering the ecological awareness that really took modern paganism from a handful of underground fringe practices to the growing movement that it is. It's not for nothing that one particularly popular meme running around these days is that we could be 4 horsemen deep into the apocalypse and would still be expected to clock in on time for work. So what are the bones and sinews of this polycrisis that I keep referring to? I think really you could sum it up in 3 main points. First, neoliberal capitalism is in a terminal death spiral, and nothing really seems to be able to arrest that. Second, far-right and authoritarian politics are aggressively on the march worldwide. There's no other way to put it. That's just what is. And that poses serious problems for our movement, which I'll get into when I touch on that more. And third, it seems those in power who are not taking the mask off and saying maybe Franco had some good ideas and perhaps a jackbooted dictatorship that murders a whole lot of people is the solution to our problems, seem to mostly be fumbling around in the dark, stuck on trying to bring back a normal that wasn't really sustainable in the first place and can't be brought back. Though there are excellent ideas, solutions, and strategies being proposed by people outside of the halls of power, with some noteworthy exceptions, those within the halls of power are either reaching for a club to bludgeon everyone into submission, or are stumbling around in a dreary haze, desperately hoping against all odds that somehow the status quo can resume. To talk about number one briefly, the core of what makes neoliberalism and the neoliberal capitalist system what it is how it is able to integrate production and distribution of goods on a global scale in what's often referred to as frictionless supply chains. This, combined with frictionless movement of capital, is what has made so much of what we associate with economic development, growth, as well as deindustrialization, offshoring, and all this other stuff possible. COVID-19 really upset the apple cart that was neoliberal economics. This is because those global supply chains that I just mentioned all run on what's called just-in-time logistics, meaning everything in terms of your backstock and resources on hand is supposed to be available just in time. This is made possible by these globe-spanning, fast-moving supply chains and allows for businesses to cut back on expenses that would otherwise be spent on things like warehouse space, inventory, and maintaining stock that is not supposed to be sold immediately but has to be held over in case of any kind of disturbances or emergency situations. This means our entire system of economics has no slack to speak of. And COVID-19, which forced the shutdown of economic activity on a global scale, really made that a reality. Ever since then, global circumstances have refused to cooperate with settling back down. And you could say the last real point of no return, the last off-ramp that was possible for our neoliberal economy and supply chains to save themselves was before Putin invaded Russia. The oil shock that kicked off sort of guaranteed that the old way of economics can't and won't come back because the material reality making it possible isn't there. This is also happening while a new surge of fascism, mostly, I would say, pushed by the perceived and to some extent real loss of status by previously dominant groups, like, for example, in the United States, white, Christian, often Protestant, though Catholics are sometimes acceptable as long as you're not talking to somebody who's read too many Jack Chick tracts, is the norm that's catered to, complete with the nuclear family, which only really historically became a thing in the late 1940s on, as one of the central components of this. This very, you could say, really industrial model of how to organize society, where everybody is man or woman and must go forth to either be breadwinner or homemaker in some capacity or another, who produce the next generation of breadwinner, homemaker, worker, caregiver, and other, endless inputs for keeping this whole economy thing going, as well as consumers of products and services along the way, gave the institutions who had become or appointed themselves as the enforcers of this order quite a bit of power and influence. The decline of traditional religion, which I got into earlier, has struck significant blows for these different groups, as has the very real social and material consequences of neoliberalism. To put it bluntly, the nuclear family is really not sustainable for anyone who's coming of age in this economy. I know personally that a significant factor in why I'm definitely not living a conventional life is because I have way more student debt than I care to disclose in a public setting. There's lots of research that shows people of the so-called millennial and Gen Z generational cohorts are delaying decisions like having children, buying houses, and doing all those things that are necessary to perpetuate the old nuclear family because they're all too broke, indebted, or lack sufficient job security or even affordable housing to do any of those things. This has also happened in an environment where women managed to only fairly recently break free from long-time forms of patriarchal domination. Like, for example, women in the United States couldn't open their own bank accounts until 1974. Gay liberation and the limited, though significant gains made by the civil rights movement in the long term also seriously impacted how these groups see their power and place in the United States of America. All of these grievances and misinterpretations, as well as active misrepresentation of these circumstances, have been magnified by an incredibly efficient right-wing media ecosystem that dates back to Rush Limbaugh in the late 1980s. It's also recycled a lot of the imagery and paranoid fear-mongering that was at the center of the Satanic Panic and the previous Red Scares. All these dynamics are really clearly on display when you're talking about Donald Trump, the forces behind Brexit, Viktor Orban's single-party government in Hungary, the Law and Justice Party regime in Poland, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Narendra Modi's India. And in response to this is what I would describe as stuff that looks a lot like fumbling about in the dark, groping for solutions based on what can best restore the status quo. Joe Biden, for example, has consistently refused to consider pursuing aggressive student loan debt forgiveness programs or any substantive approaches to healthcare reform. His party also was incredibly sluggish with the 2 years that they had thin majorities in both chambers of Congress. The same Joe Biden who refused to bypass Congress on student debt forgiveness and issue an executive order has just recently used an executive order to bypass Congress so that he could ship more arms to Israel to drop on Gaza. Biden has also refused to capitalize on the massive street-level support for serious police reform and reallocation of funding away from the security state and towards things like rebuilding crumbling infrastructure or any number of other necessary things, despite the fact that this is a highly popular proposition within voters of his own party. Just as sending bombs to Israel is deeply unpopular with many of those same groups. The main upsets that have been happening have mostly been outside of the usual channels of power, whether that's private citizens suing the states of Maine, Colorado, and others to keep Donald Trump off the presidential ballot for, attempting to overthrow the government and suspend democracy and all that jazz. Or upset wins at the grassroots level on issues like abortion. This is stuff that has, again, not come from the established powers of the Democratic Party, but from people operating on their own, responding to these problems as best as they can. The reason I bring all these factors up is because heathens and pagans are also going to have to contend with them in the coming year. the dire economy hits our community in particular especially hard because we do tend to be less affluent, more precarious, and also younger than mainstream society. The rise of fascism in the present day also is its own direct threat to us, in part because fascists don't really have much tolerance for anyone who falls outside of their tightly prescribed mainstream, but also because they are marching underneath a cross and proclaiming the return of Christ as Lord. The somewhat religiously pluralistic alt-right of 2016 and 2017 has clearly lost out to the folks who were posting the Deus Vult memes, as Christian nationalism has taken the reins, as well as the lead, within rising far-right authoritarianism and extremism. That particular wrinkle means anyone who's doing something that they consider to be small p pagan, which is pretty much everything that big P pagans and big H heathens do, is going to be unacceptable in the world they're trying to build. Even though our communities are not currently being deliberately targeted with the kind of ferocity or energy that is being thrown at, like, say, trans people worldwide, I don't think we should ever forget for a single moment these same apparatuses can very easily be turned against us, and because as a community we tend to be more queer positive and accepting of ideas like maybe we should save the planet than these kind of Christian nationalists are, we're already sort of within the target zone to begin with. Even if we are not deliberately and systematically persecuted, we're getting caught up in the blast zone anyway, simply because of where our values, beliefs, and practices live. This will also be happening in a world where climate despair and climate change's pressures will likely accelerate the growth of paganism, heathenry, and potentially force a lot of folks and ideas in that could push things into a much nastier and potentially far more destructive direction. Addressing these different challenges is going to require a lot of conversation, new kinds of community organizing that allow for our communities to effectively integrate all these new potential and interested folks who are going to be coming in, as well as then materially and socially sustaining them. I've definitely got some ideas about how we can be doing that, which I'll be talking about more over the course of the rest of this year. But I'm not going to claim that I somehow have all or even most of the answers to these challenges. What matters is that I think we have to be aware of what it is that's facing us, that our movement is entering a new phase where we're going to require a lot of deliberate organization and mass-scale mobilization of resources to be able to effectively survive and thrive while still maintaining a lot of what makes us what we are. With that challenge firmly in front of us, I think it's now time to talk green shoots. That is, the new little seedlings that are starting to sprout of better possibility and tools that can help us build both our own future and a better future for the world. These, I think, can be best summed up in two big categories, which also go hand in hand with that. So far, it doesn't look like the growth of paganism or heathenry is going to be slowing down anytime soon. And these are that climate change and renewable energy is looking a lot more solvable than it seemed even a year ago. And as intimidating as far-right power and authoritarianism seems to be, they are not invincible and have suffered some initial setbacks, suggesting their support base is not enough to win simply by imposing their dictates through force of law. In the world of climate change, the price of renewable energy keeps getting cheaper and has since 2020 been consistently cheaper than all other available fossil fuel alternatives. The rate at which the cost of renewable energy, both to build and to use, has been declining is simply incredible, and it promises to make it much easier to make the renewable energy transition. It's no longer a question, economically speaking, of investing huge amounts of resources and effort into an unproven system, but rather one of investing what will still be a significant amount of effort and resources into a system that now outperforms dirty energy and carbon fuel. The Inflation Reduction Act, which in fairness is one of those few things that the current U.S. government has done that's genuinely beneficial in a big way, has accelerated this process, as have other spending plans in the European Union and other parts of the world, all triggered by Russia's oil shock. There is a certain twisted irony that Putin's regime, which depends on oil and gas, may have signed the death warrant for those two things by pursuing his imperial ambitions in Ukraine. Science is also showing that ecosystems and habitats are a lot more resilient than we may have given them credit for. Now, this doesn't mean that lost species and extinctions can be reversed or anything like that, but ecological regeneration, habitat restoration, and rewilding are projects that seem less fanciful and more doable, with growing interest in grassroots communities, governments, and everywhere in between across the planet. In short, while some level of climate change is unavoidable, catastrophe may be averted, and there may still be room for recovery, all of which is going to depend on, among other things, a more ecologically based understanding of humanity in the world, something which pagan spiritualities are more than happy to help support and articulate. Far-right extremism is also, at least fairly recently, losing ground and losing steam. On December 12th of just this past year, Poland's National Conservative Law and Justice Party, which, among other things, amended the Polish constitution to say that Christ is king in Poland, suppressed newspapers and press organizations that opposed them, harassed opposition party members, and effectively created one-party rule for nearly a decade, was removed from power after losing a confidence vote and being drummed out of office. Jair Bolsonaro's regime in Brazil also was thrown out at the ballot box with the election of Luiz Lula da Silva as the new president of Brazil. Lula, as he is often referred to by his supporters, has also wasted no time in pursuing prosecutions against Bolsonaro supporters who attempted an abortive and poorly planned coup on January 6th of 2023, U.S. states like Kansas and Ohio, often considered solidly conservative Republican states, have roundly delivered stunning referendum results affirming support for abortion rights and guaranteeing their protection in both states, while Republicans campaigning hard on anti-trans panic in the state of Michigan were so soundly defeated that the opposing Democrats have cemented control over the governorship and both chambers of the legislature. The state of Wisconsin similarly elected a liberal majority to the state Supreme Court, which has since struck down gerrymandered legislative maps which were essential to maintaining hard-right government control in that state. Even though Joe Biden and the Democratic Party generally are not popular, culture war, persecuting trans people, going after abortion, which is broadly supported in the United States, and attempting to run cover for the January 6th coup attempt are all pretty resoundingly unpopular, and there does seem to be a solid consensus forming in the United States that opposes a rollback of democratic rights, increasing people's ability to participate in government, and challenging the culture war. In short, the far right's power, despite all their efforts and influence, has been increasingly coming up short and facing increasing popular opposition. Even though many critical institutions are not yet catching up and are also under assault by these different right-wing fascistic forces, I think there is at least some evidence to suggest that the far right does not have the kind of power they think they do, and may be overplaying their hand in a lot of critical ways. Even the tide of rising political violence and escalation by right-wing forces in the United States still hasn't come close to the lowest ebb of the kind of brutal street fighting that was the norm in Weimar-era German politics in the lead-up to the Nazi Party's takeover. Now, certainly part of this was because there was a huge population of radicalized military-age men who had just been thrown through the meat grinder of the First World War and all the hellish inferno that implies. So, what's a police barricade after facing down gas machine guns and explosive artillery while eating rats in a trench? There is no question that far-right forces in the United States are willing and, to some extent, able to engage in political violence, as they did on January 6th and continue to do so at a low level in many different parts of the country. But it must be said that the golden opportunity for the kind of militant far-right that sees itself as the thin blue line between order and chaos that was the 2020 George Floyd uprising saw the far right, who had been building to a moment like this for years when they would get to exercise their might against a dangerous urban insurgency, really come up short. Now, this isn't to say that there was not harm done, lives lost, or serious other damage done during the course of the 2020 protest movement. But it's important to keep in mind that the worst of it being people like Kyle Rittenhouse and also arguably January 6th was never at any point enough to simply smash a movement that at its peak enjoyed the support of nearly 2/3 of the population in the United States of America, and was the largest mass movement in U.S. history. Now, I'm not trying to downplay the willingness or ability of far-right actors to engage in terroristic or other forms of political violence. What I'm saying is there also may be far more people in places like the United States who are willing to take to the streets to stop that. And if anything like what happened in 2020 happens again in the U.S., it's doubtful that even a fully mobilized and militarized far right could simply brush that aside. Now, nothing about this is certain, and I am, of course, trying to inspire a bit of optimism going into what's going to be a really rough and dark year for a lot of people. The challenges ahead of us are ones that can be overcome, as long as we find ways to help and support each other, bring our communities together, and leave no one behind. So, with that, I'm going to sign off. I hope that some of the more optimistic elements of what I've talked about are the things that shine through, and that the adversity ahead inspires people to rise to the occasion rather than shrink back from the threat that it brings. This is not going to be an easy time ahead, but I think this diverse array of movements that we call heathen, pagan, and witch have it within us to be a key force for bringing out those better things and making that better world, while also finding ways to help those who come to us for answers and guidance. So with all of that said, this has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer. May 2024 end in a better place than where it began. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.